Dr. Kim, I'm so excited about you being here, and I just think it's going to be awesome for our people to get to hear from you and to hear from a real science person on how amazing the human body is. But tell us, how did you actually get into science?
I'm glad to be here today. I'm particularly speaking because I also come from a faith background and just kind of sharing with you my own personal story as a scientist, but also a Christian as well. So because of my parents, I got interested in science very early on. And I studied biochemistry in undergrad, followed by searching for what my calling was. I got into working at a laboratory where I just fell in love with the research and the idea of discovery. And then I went on to get my doctorate degree in genetics, human genetics at Baylor, which is here in Houston. And then I went off and did a postdoc. So my graduate degree was in human genetics, and then I went and studied plant biology at Rice University, and then now I'm in an administrative role at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So AAAS is a secular, non-religious organization, and I am part of the program called Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion.
So Dr. Say, your area of specialty is human genetics, right?
Yep, genetics.
All right. Well, so let me ask you, just give us kind of an overview. What is DNA?
So everything we know in life is encoded by what is called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. And so even from plants to humans, there is in every cell a sequence of kind of like a ticker tape of letters or bases, as they call it, called A, T, G, and C, that kind of codes who we are in life, or what we see on the outside and what we see on the inside. And so these A, T, G, and C form a ladder-like rung that matches up to each other. And so you can think of a really, really long ladder. And just to give you some scale, this long ladder of genetic sequence in every cell is about 6 feet tall. So you can just imagine how long it is if it's for every single cell in our body.
And every little part of that is teeny tiny, right?
And every little part of that is teeny tiny. So these long sequence of A, T, G, and C's, or bases, are very similar to what is in a computer, like on-off, like ones and zeros that encode computer software programs. So if computers have ones and zeros and they're complex, can you think of 4 bases, which is A, T, G, and C, and the order that they're in encodes who we are as humans or any other life form.
And it's actually even a little more complex than that, because you specialized in an area called epigenetics.
Exactly, yeah. So I studied a field which is fairly new in terms of science. So it really became in boom about 20 years ago, the idea that there is something else beyond DNA. So historically, we thought what's passed down from mom and dad to a child is this DNA sequence that's inherited, right? It encodes, we get some from mom, we get some from dad, and that makes up who we are, right? It turns out that in addition to this DNA sequence, there's what's called an epigenetics. So epi means on, it's a Greek word for up, on top of, or in addition to. And so in addition to this DNA ladder, there's these markers on the DNA that also get somewhat transferred to parent to child.
So tell me the particular area that you really focused in on.
So I studied the role of epigenetics in learning and memory. And so I particularly looked at how epigenetics and that mechanism works in encoding how we remember and how we learn. Our brain is composed of 100 billion neurons. And so to give you the scale, there's 100 billion galaxies in our universe. And so that's how complex our brains are. And so in any one of those cells in our brain, which is called a neuron, they have connections. And it turns out that when we remember or learn something, it changes the DNA sequence of these epigenetic markers. And in doing so, it strengthens a neuron connection to another neuron or weakens a neuron connection to another neuron. And so those changes on a neuron in a brain results in what we remember. That's how these epigenetic markers and these genes play a role in how we remember what I ate yesterday, or how I know who my mom is, and those kind of historical memories that we form, or even how we learn in school.
So how does epigenetics kind of play out in things that we might see in the world around us?
So epigenetics is also responsible for instances where the gene itself, the DNA sequence, is the same. So for example, in twins, twins are monozygotic or identical twins. They have the same DNA sequence. But it turns out any mom can tell you that two twins are very different, right? A lot of that is a question of nurture versus nature, how the experience is, but it's also how epigenetics play a role both in the womb but outside of the womb that changes how those genes are expressed in either of the twins. It is also shown in insects, in metamorphosis for things like butterflies. Everything from larvae to caterpillar to the beautiful butterfly, it's all the same DNA. They didn't go out and change all their DNA sequences, right? From that animal kept its DNA from the whole entire life stage. But it's the epigenetic mechanisms that occur in the biology of the butterfly that that helps it to metamorphosize into a butterfly from a caterpillar.
So, Dr. Kim, I know you work for a secular organization, and so I really want to talk to you about your own personal beliefs of how you kind of see how science and your faith in God fit together.
Because I grew up in a Christian home, I didn't, thankfully, through grace of God, I didn't grow up in a culture or an environment where it was stressed that I had to pick one or the other, either Christianity or the sciences. And so I was encouraged to continuously wonder and continuously be curious about the world, and that inspired the study of science. And the way that I see science and faith is, as I think Bacon was the one who said this, the idea that nature is God's book of showing who he is versus scripture of showing who Christ is. And just being able to see God in a different light through the creation and through the wonder of the universe and through biology. There are these issues, and there are these issues that people struggle with. And there are moments where you say, why is this mechanism this way, or why is this? And I think what I have experienced in my life is that God is very faithful. Even if I don't understand it at the moment, that we might be able to tomorrow. And the thing about science that I think most people don't, I want to share with more people, is that scientists are very comfortable with not knowing, right? Because we're always seeking the boundaries and the frontiers, and to be not afraid to ask those questions. And it's okay that, part of the learning process of science is asking and experimenting, and sometimes you don't get the answers to what you thought it was. In some ways, it's very much like faith. There are questions that we don't know and we can't have answers to at this time. And being comfortable with that and trusting in God's goodness and trusting in God's grace through that process, I think is what a Christian walk is about.
What would you say to people that doubt because of science or because of whatever they hear out in society, that they begin to doubt? What would you tell them?
Well, I would say that it's nothing new. Even Jesus, the first thing when Jesus came back after he resurrected, and doubtful Thomas said, "Can I poke you?" Right? To see if you're real, to see if you're the real Jesus. The beautiful thing is Jesus allowed him to. And it's okay to ask those questions. I would say God embraces those kind of moments. He rather want us to reach out to him rather than walk away, and not be shy and not be afraid to ask those questions. Because again, in my life, God's been very faithful and gracious to those who reach out.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just this perception that you have to pick or choose. You've got to leave God at the door to the science lab, and you've got to leave reason and science at the door to the church house. And what would you say to those people that just feel that way?
Even St. Augustine said, when Christians talk to non-Christians about things that the non-Christian knows really well and do it very badly, right, then how are they going to believe in the gospel, basically, right? That's what he says, paraphrased. I think it's great that your church and congregation is doing something like this. More churches need to do something like this.
Tell me about how you personally see God's creativity, his wonder, as you study genetics and DNA.
So a lot of scientists will tell you about their eureka moment when they're going through their research. And I had a short research stint between undergraduate and graduate where I was doing bench science and development biology. And that's how I knew when I wanted to go into research science. And that's how I knew, I think, this is my calling. This is what I would like to do. Was this moment when you see a development. I spent a lot of time looking through the microscope, a development of a mouse embryo to see its growth. And it's just an amazing feeling, I think, for a scientist to say, I'm the only one looking at this right at that moment. Nobody else on this earth has seen this exact moment. And that's a remarkable feeling. And to know that, I think as a scientist and personally of one of faith, is that God has that much detail. I mean, God's probably staring at us, for each one of us, through the microscope at that moment, right? Like, he is very actively involved in our life. And to know that he sees us that closely, there's a sense of joy and a sense of appreciation, right, in that amount of detail and creativity.
Dr. Kim, is it fair to say that science can't explain everything about who we are as individuals?
I think there are certainly questions that science can't get to. Questions like, what is love, right? So there are biological responses. You know, if you love somebody, they say that, you know, there are all these biological responses. But to actually try to understand that is a hard one to untangle with just science. But there's obviously a good example from God's love for us. There's also questions about consciousness and free will. I studied, as I mentioned earlier, I studied the brain, and we can know down to the neuron what each neuron does, but how does that translate into who we are as a person? What is uniqueness about human? What is unique about you? What is unique about me? And questions about how I decide what to do, and questions about morality, the idea of, as many cultures and throughout history, we've always known what is right and what is wrong. Now, those may be different, slightly different depending on the culture, but to strive for what is good, to know what is good and what is right and what is wrong. Those are things I don't think science can answer and we don't understand, but certainly something that I think from a spiritual side can offer us a lot of guidance.
As a biologist, what does it mean to you when the Bible says we are fearfully and wonderfully made?
So as a believer and a biologist, I see that there's a level of precision and just a sense of wonder in how, as the person that I am, I come from a sequence of A, T, Gs, and Cs, and a code and a sequence of that's copied onto an MRI exactly. So if there's any one error in one of those bases, in the 3 billion bases we have in our body, if there's one error, it can create havoc for us, right? So the fact that it's copied exactly onto an mRNA and that it encodes a protein and it forms who we are today, there's a sense of exactness, there's a sense of precision, there's a sense of wonder in how it can come from that to you and me. We're sitting here today. It's just really remarkable and amazing. And in that sense, it's wondrous. It's fearfully and wonderfully made. The fact that we're sitting here and we're talking and the excitement about science, I think in some ways are a blessing from God, because it's curiosity. That's wondering about what God has planted in us to ask.